The paper bag split open just as the man reached the curb, sending a cascade of apples rolling into the street. Jake Thompson, a lanky 17-year-old with earbuds firmly planted in his ears, had been skateboarding down the sidewalk when he saw it happen. He had planned to roll right by, maybe glance over his shoulder to make sure the man wasn't hurt, but something made him stop. Maybe it was the way the elderly man sighed heavily, resting his hands on his knees as if the simple act of bending down to retrieve the apples was too much. Or maybe it was the way everyone else kept walking, not even sparing a glance. Jake kicked his skateboard to the side, pulled out his earbuds, and jogged over. "Hey, let me help you with that," he offered, crouching down to grab a few apples before they could roll into the gutter. The man straightened up slowly, a look of surprise crossing his face. "Oh, thank you, young man," he said, his voice warm but strained. "I thought I could manage, but this old back of mine has other ideas." Jake smiled as he scooped up the last apple and handed it to the man. "No problem. Do you live nearby? I can carry these for you." The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Just a few blocks down. I'd appreciate the help. My name's Walter, by the way, Walter Grayson." "I'm Jake," he replied, balancing the torn bag under one arm as he grabbed another bag that looked like it might split any second. "Let's get you home before these bags give up completely." As they walked, Walter told Jake about how he'd lived in the neighborhood for nearly 50 years. He used to run a small hardware store down on Maple Street, but he'd sold it when he retired. His wife had passed away some years ago, and now it was just him and his little dog, Max, in a house that felt much too big most days. "Must be tough doing all this on your own," Jake said, glancing down at the sagging grocery bags. Walter chuckled softly. "I manage, though days like this make me miss the days when I had a bit more spring in my step." When they reached Walter's house, a modest but charming home with a freshly painted white fence, Jake carried the groceries inside and set them on the kitchen counter. Walter thanked him profusely, even insisting he take a few cookies from a tin on the counter. "You didn't have to do this, you know," Walter said, as Jake stuffed a chocolate chip cookie into his mouth. "Not many young folks these days would stop to help an old man like me." Jake shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed by the praise. "It's no big deal. My mom's always telling me to look out for people. Besides, you looked like you could use a hand." Walter smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well, you've made an old man's day, Jake, thank you." Jake waved it off, but as he skateboarded home, he couldn't stop thinking about Walter. He hadn't seemed sad exactly, but there was a loneliness about him that Jake couldn't shake. When he got home, his mom, Linda, was in the kitchen, sorting through a stack of bills with a furrowed brow. Jake noticed the tension in her shoulders and decided not to mention Walter right away. Money had been tight since his dad's hours got cut at the factory, and Jake didn't want to add to her stress. "Dinner in the oven," Linda said without looking up. "How was your day?" "Good," Jake replied, grabbing a soda from the fridge. "Helped a guy with his groceries." Linda glanced up, her expression softening. "That was nice of you. Did he say thank you?" Jake grinned. "Yeah, he even gave me cookies." "See," Linda said with a small smile, "kindness always comes back around." Jake wasn't so sure about that. Life hadn't been particularly kind to his family lately, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he decided he'd stop by Walter's house the next time he had a free afternoon. The old man seemed like he could use a little company, and Jake figured it wouldn't hurt to check in on him. What Jake didn't know was that this small act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change his family's life forever. The next Saturday, Jake slid his skateboard under the porch steps and knocked on Walter's door. It had been a long week at school, and his dad had been working extra shifts to make up for the reduced hours, leaving the house quieter than usual. Jake figured spending time with Walter might be a good distraction. After a moment, the door opened, and Walter stood there, wearing a cardigan that looked a little too big for his thin frame. His face lit up when he saw Jake. "Well, this is a pleasant surprise. Jake, right?" Yeah, Jake said, shifting on his feet. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by, see how you're doing. Walter chuckled and stepped aside. Come in, come in. I was just about to make some tea. You like tea? Sure, Jake said, even though he wasn't much of a tea drinker. He followed Walter into the kitchen, where the little dog, Max, wagged his tail eagerly at the sight of a new face. Jake crouched down to pet him, earning a happy bark. Max likes you already, Walter said, filling a kettle with water. He's a good judge of character. Jake smiled, scratching behind Max's ears. He seems cool. Looks like he keeps you company. Oh, he does, Walter said, setting the kettle on the stove. But he's not much for conversation. It's nice to have someone to talk to every now and then. They sat at the kitchen table, the tea steaming in mismatched mugs. Walter asked Jake about school, his family, and his plans for the future. Jake found himself talking more than he expected, sharing how he felt stuck sometimes, like he didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. Walter listened intently, nodding thoughtfully. You've got time to figure it out, Walter said finally. But I'll tell you this, the best things in life usually come when you least expect them, kind of like meeting you last week. Jake laughed. I think you're giving me too much credit. It was just groceries. It was more than that, Walter said firmly. You saw someone who needed help and you stepped up. That's rare these days, Jake. Don't underestimate the power of small kindnesses. Jake didn't know how to respond to that, so he just sipped his tea. Before he left, Walter asked if Jake could help him with a small favor. The gutters on the house were clogged with leaves, and Walter said he'd been meaning to clean them, but hadn't gotten around to it. Don't worry about it, Jake said. I can come by tomorrow and take care of it. Walter looked relieved. You're a good kid, Jake. Your parents must be proud. The next day, Jake showed up with a ladder he borrowed from his neighbor. It only took about an hour to clear out the gutters, and Walter insisted on paying him, but Jake refused. Instead, Walter made him a sandwich, and they spent the afternoon playing cards at the kitchen table while Max snoozed at their feet. Over the next few weeks, Jake started stopping by Walter's house regularly. Sometimes he'd help with small chores, like fixing a squeaky door hinge or raking leaves in the yard. Other times, they'd just sit and talk. Walter shared stories about his wife, Margaret, and the years they spent running the hardware store. He even showed Jake an old photo album, pointing out pictures of himself and Margaret at their wedding, on vacations, and during quiet moments at home. She was my rock, Walter said, his voice soft. Losing her was the hardest thing I've ever been through, but life goes on, doesn't it? Jake nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. He thought about his own parents and how hard they were working to keep things afloat. He didn't say it out loud, but he hoped life would get a little easier for them soon. One Saturday afternoon, as Jake was finishing up mowing Walter's lawn, a man in a suit pulled up in a sleek black car. He stepped out, looking around as though he wasn't used to being in a quiet neighborhood like this. Excuse me, the man said, approaching Jake. I'm looking for Mr. Grayson. He's inside, Jake replied, brushing grass clippings off his jeans. You a friend of his? Something like that, the man said, offering a polite smile. Thank you. Jake watched as the man walked up to the door and knocked. Walter answered, and after a brief exchange, the man stepped inside. Curious but not wanting to pry, Jake finished putting the lawn mower away and headed home. The following week, Jake stopped by Walter's house again, but this time Walter seemed distracted. He kept glancing at the clock and fidgeting with his hands. Everything okay? Jake asked, setting a screwdriver on the counter after tightening a loose cabinet hinge. Walter hesitated, then nodded. Oh, yes, just waiting on something, nothing to worry about. Jake didn't press further, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on. He decided to let it go, figuring Walter would tell him if it was important. What Jake didn't realize was that whatever Walter was waiting for would soon change everything, not just for Jake, but for his whole family. The letter arrived on a crisp Thursday morning, tucked among the usual stack of junk mail and bills. Linda was sorting through the pile at the kitchen table when she noticed it. The envelope was thick, with an unfamiliar crest embossed on the upper corner. Her name and address were written in neat, precise handwriting. There was no return address. "Jake," she called, holding the envelope up as she squinted at it. "Did you order something? This doesn't look like a bill." Jake shuffled into the kitchen, still wearing his pajama bottoms despite it being nearly noon. He was on spring break, and sleeping in had become his favorite pastime. "Huh," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "This," Linda said, waving the envelope. "It's addressed to me, but it looks formal. Did you sign me up for something again?" "Nope," Jake said, shaking his head. "Not guilty this time." Linda frowned, flipping the envelope over in her hands before finally breaking the seal. Jake leaned against the counter, watching as she unfolded the thick sheet of paper inside. Her brow furrowed as her eyes scanned the page. "Mom," Jake prompted when she didn't say anything for a moment. Linda looked up at him, her face pale with a mix of surprise and confusion. It's from someone named Walter Grayson," she said slowly. "Do you know him?" Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, I know him. He's the old guy I helped with groceries a few weeks back. Why? What's it say?" Linda glanced back down at the letter, her hands trembling slightly as she read aloud. "Dear Mrs. Thompson, I hope this letter finds you well. Over the past several weeks, I've had the pleasure of getting to know your son, Jake. He's an exceptional young man, kind, hardworking, and thoughtful in ways that are rare for someone his age. His willingness to help me, time and time again, has been a bright spot in my days. What Jake doesn't know is that I've spent most of my life building a family business that has been very successful. My late wife and I never had children, and as I grow older, I find myself reflecting on what truly matters. Jake's selflessness reminded me of the values that my wife and I held dear, values we always wished to pass on to a younger generation. It's because of this that I would like to extend a gesture of gratitude to your family. Please find enclosed a check for $10,000. I hope this will ease some of the burdens you may be facing and provide opportunities for Jake to continue being the remarkable young man that he is. With warm regards, Walter Grayson." Linda's voice cracked as she finished reading. She looked up at Jake, her eyes wide. There's a check in here," she whispered, pulling it out of the envelope with shaking hands. Jake's jaw dropped as he stared at the piece of paper. $10,000? Are you serious?" Linda nodded, her hands still trembling. "Jake, what did you do to deserve this?" I don't know," Jake stammered. "I just helped him with groceries, and then I started going over to his house to help with chores and stuff. I didn't do anything special." Linda set the check down on the table, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. "Jake, this could change everything for us. We've been behind on bills for months. This could give us a chance to catch up, maybe even save a little." Jake felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, disbelief, and a touch of embarrassment. "I didn't do it for money," he said quietly. "I just thought he seemed lonely." Linda reached out and pulled him into a tight hug. "I know, sweetheart. That's what makes this so amazing. You didn't expect anything, and yet here it is." Just then, the front door opened, and Jake's dad, Mike, walked in, his lunchbox in hand and his work boots leaving faint smudges on the floor. He stopped short when he saw Linda wiping her eyes and Jake looking like he'd just seen a ghost. "What's going on?" Mike asked, setting his lunchbox on the counter. Linda handed him the letter and the check without a word. Mike's eyebrows shot up as he read through it, his lips moving slightly with the words. When he reached the end, he let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he said, looking at Jake. "You've been holding out on us, kid. I didn't even know you'd been helping this guy." Jake shrugged, feeling a little awkward. It didn't seem like a big deal. He's just a nice old guy who needed a hand. Mike clapped a hand on Jake's shoulder, a rare smile breaking across his usually tired face. "Well, it looks like it was a big deal to him. I'm proud of you, son." The next day, Jake decided he needed to thank Walter in person. He rode his skateboard over to Walter's house, the check tucked safely into his backpack. When he knocked on the door, Walter answered with a knowing smile. "I was wondering when you'd stop by," Walter said, stepping aside to let Jake in. Jake didn't waste any time. "Mr. Grayson, I got your letter and the check. I don't even know what to say. It's too much." Walter shook his head, gesturing for Jake to sit down. "Not at all, Jake. It's the least I could do. You've given me something that money can't buy: friendship, kindness, and a reason to look forward to each day. That's worth far more than any check." Jake felt a lump in his throat. "But $10,000, that's a lot of money. Are you sure?" Walter chuckled. "Jake, I've been fortunate in my life. My wife and I worked hard and we built something we were proud of. But at the end of the day, it's just money. What matters is how you use it to make a difference. And I know you and your family will do just that." Jake nodded slowly, realizing that Walter wasn't going to take no for an answer. "Thank you," he said finally, "for everything." Walter smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "No, Jake, thank you." When Jake returned home that afternoon, he handed the check to his mom. "Mr. Grayson said it's ours," he told her. "No strings attached." Linda pulled him into another hug, her voice thick with emotion. "Jake, you've always been a good kid, but today you're my hero." For the first time in weeks, the house felt light, like a weight had been lifted. And Jake realized that Walter was right sometimes. The best things in life come when you least expect them. A week later, Walter called Jake and asked if he could stop by his house. His voice had a certain warmth, but there was also a hint of something else: anticipation, maybe. Jake agreed, grabbing his skateboard and heading over that afternoon. When Jake arrived, Walter was already waiting on the porch, wearing his usual cardigan and a smile that seemed a little wider than usual. "Come on in, Jake," he said, waving him inside. Max barked happily from the living room, his tail wagging so hard it thumped against the couch. "Everything okay, Mr. Grayson?" Jake asked, stepping into the familiar warmth of the house. Walter chuckled, motioning for Jake to sit at the kitchen table. "More than okay. I just wanted to share something with you. Let me grab something first." He shuffled toward the small office off the hallway, leaving Jake to pet Max and wonder what this was all about. When Walter returned, he was holding a faded leather-bound journal and a small stack of papers tied together with a ribbon. He sat across from Jake and placed the items on the table between them. "I've been doing some thinking, Jake," Walter began, his tone serious but kind. "About how much you've done for me and what I want the rest of my life to look like. You've inspired me, you know." Jake blinked, caught off guard. "Me, what did I do?" Walter smiled. "You reminded me of the kind of person I always wanted to be. Someone who looks out for others, who takes the time to make a difference, even in small ways. You've done that without expecting anything in return, and that's rare." Jake felt his face flush. He wasn't used to this kind of praise. I was just trying to help." "And you did," Walter said firmly, "more than you realize." Walter opened the journal, flipping through its pages until he found what he was looking for. He slid it across the table to Jake. "This was my wife Margaret's idea, years ago. We called it the Grayson Fund. It's a list of all the ways we wanted to use what we'd earned to give back to others. We never got around to doing as much as we'd hoped before she passed, but I've been thinking it's time to change that." Jake looked down at the journal. The pages were filled with Margaret's neat handwriting, listing things like donate to local schools, help families in need, and create scholarships. It was clear this wasn't just a passing thought, this was something they'd both cared deeply about. "I want to start with you and your family," Walter continued. "But I also want to go beyond that. I've been talking to my lawyer about setting up a foundation, something that will keep Margaret's dream alive, and I want you to be a part of it." Jake's eyes widened. "Me, but I don't know anything about stuff like that." Walter chuckled. "That's okay. You've got time to learn, and I think you'll be very good at it. You care about people, Jake. That's the most important thing. Jake didn't know what to say. The idea of being involved in something so big was overwhelming, but also exciting. I don't know, Mr. Grayson. What if I mess it up? Walter reached across the table and patted Jake's hand. You won't, and I'll be here to guide you every step of the way. Jake nodded slowly, the weight of Walter's trust sinking in. Okay, I'll try. That's all I ask, Walter said with a smile. Over the next few weeks, Jake and Walter spent more and more time together, going over plans for the foundation and talking about the kind of impact they wanted to make. Walter even introduced Jake to his lawyer, Mr. Harlan, who was a tall man with a booming laugh and a knack for making complicated things sound simple. One afternoon, as they were wrapping up a meeting, Walter turned to Jake with a twinkle in his eye. By the way, there's something else I've been meaning to tell you. Jake raised an eyebrow. What's that? I've decided to sell the house, Walter said. It's too much for me to manage on my own, and I want to downsize to something cozier. But don't worry, I'll still be around. I'm not going anywhere. Jake nodded, understanding. That makes sense. Do you know where you're moving? Walter grinned. Not far. I found a lovely little condo just a few miles away. It's perfect for me and Max. The move happened quickly, and Jake helped Walter pack up his belongings, including Margaret's photo albums and the journal that had started it all. On the day of the move, Walter handed Jake an envelope with his name on it. What's this? Jake asked, turning it over in his hands. Just a little something to say thank you, Walter said, for everything. Jake opened the envelope and found a check made out to him for $5,000. His jaw dropped. Mr. Grayson, I can't take this. Yes, you can, Walter said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I want you to use it for something that makes you happy. Maybe put it toward school or a trip or whatever you like. Consider it an investment in your future. Jake swallowed hard, trying to process the generosity. I don't know how to thank you. You already have, Walter said simply, by being you. In the weeks that followed, Jake's life began to change in ways he hadn't expected. His parents used Walter's initial gift to catch up on bills and even start a small savings account. Jake decided to put the $5,000 toward college, something he hadn't been sure he'd be able to afford before. But more than the money, it was Walter's belief in him that left the biggest impact. Jake started volunteering at local events, inspired by the idea of giving back. And every time he doubted himself, he thought of Walter's words, "You care about people. That's the most important thing." As summer turned to fall, Jake and Walter continued to meet regularly, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. And though neither of them could predict what the future held, one thing was certain. Their lives had been forever changed by a simple act of kindness and the unexpected friendship that followed.